In part 1, we explored how to recognize narcissistic traits in a loved one, how to see both the overt and covert patterns, the manipulations, and the ways these dynamics show up in your life. Now that you've gained that awareness, the next step is, what do you do with it? So you've recognized that a loved one is exhibiting narcissistic characteristics. Now what, you may be asking? Perhaps you've already tried the commonly suggested techniques. You've set boundaries, experimented with, and I quote, gray rocking, and limited emotional engagement. But maybe you haven't tried no contact, either because it feels impossible, because you hope things might improve, or because it's just not possible. The relationship is intertwined with family, finances, or other responsibilities. If you're not interested in leaving the relationship, the question then becomes, how can you maintain your sense of self, protect your emotional well-being, and navigate this relationship without losing yourself in the process? Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In this episode, we're going to break down how narcissistic defensive behaviors show up in everyday interactions, explore the ways you might be unconsciously pulled into roles you didn't choose, and, most importantly, provide practical strategies for navigating these relationships without losing your sense of self. Let's get right into this. From a psychodynamic perspective, narcissism is not just arrogance, entitlement, control, or manipulation. It's a defensive structure built to protect and hold together a fragile sense of self. We have to remember, the entire structure is also designed to obtain what is known as narcissistic supply, attention, admiration, validation, or control that temporarily stabilizes the fragile self underneath. I won't go into that here since we covered it already more thoroughly in part 1. So, how can you navigate a relationship with someone exhibiting these traits without losing yourself? How can you ever be more, for instance, than their emotional regulator or giver of narcissistic supplies? One useful approach is to focus on 3 key strategies that can help you maintain perspective, protect your emotional health, and respond from awareness rather than instinct. The first strategy is to recognize the narcissistic defensive structure. We were just saying the first step is to recognize the narcissistic defensive structure. But what does this actually mean? Individuals with narcissistic tendencies often construct a grandiose self-image to defend against deep-seated feelings of what? Who knows what? That's the whole point of this structure, to patch up or hide more painful and vulnerable feelings and needs. From what I've discovered, when the grandiosity collapses, when a need goes unmet, we typically see painful feelings of inadequacy, shame, humiliation, and powerlessness, to name just a few. It's important to understand that the manifest presentation of demanding arrogance, entitlement, power, and at times manipulation are, and I quote, usually, I put emphasis on that, they're usually protective rather than inherently malicious. Keeping this in mind allows you to take up a more strategic approach. This shift in your thinking from malicious to protective is crucial for step 1. So this is a critical part of step 1, because if you only see the behavior as an attack or manipulation, you will respond defensively or submissively, which locks you deeper into the cycle. But if you can hold in mind that these egregious behaviors are covering, for example, unbearable shame or a deep sense of inadequacy, you can start to feel less personally wounded. I want to make this point clear. This perspective doesn't excuse the harm, but it puts you in a position of strength rather than reactivity. To make this more concrete, here's a prototypical example of how these dynamics often play out in relationships. In an earlier episode, I spoke about a patient whose mother was exhibiting covert narcissistic defenses and frequently would make her daughter, my patient, feel responsible for her own hurt feelings as if my patient was doing something harmful to her. Initially, she felt personally responsible when her mother would complain, express disappointment, or describe how hurt she felt when my patient would share any good news, such as her acceptance to graduate school. Over time, by understanding her mother's behaviors as defensive expressions of her own inner struggles and unresolved issues, including issues around envy, jealousy, and separation, my patient was able to respond with thoughtful comments rather than automatically falling into guilt, explaining herself, or submission. She began to see that her mother's reactions were not truly about her, but rather about her mother's fragile sense of self and her own unmet emotional needs. In other words, as you begin to see behaviors as signals of internal turmoil and suffering rather than just personal attacks, you may reduce reactive emotional responses. In other words, you may become less reactive and therefore maintain some perspective. In my patient's case, recognizing that her mother's criticism and guilt-inducing statements were rooted in her own fragile self allowed her to shift her focus from, "What did I do wrong?" to, "What is really going on beneath my mother's words?" This helped her preserve her own emotional well-being while still engaging in the relationship with her mother. Once you begin to recognize the narcissistic defensive structure and can see behaviors as expressions of internal turmoil rather than just personal attacks, the next step is to understand how these defenses can be enacted toward you. In many relationships with narcissistic individuals, the fragile self doesn't just hide behind grandiosity. It often pushes unwanted feelings, insecurities, or impulses outward. Before we turn to the next step, I want to add, in terms of step 1, which I said is a shift in your thinking from malicious to protective. In other words, that they're not just being malicious, but they're protecting something. I wanted to add that, of course, there are exceptions to this. In cases of more malignant narcissism, some behaviors may feel like direct attacks because eliciting fear and exerting domination and control is how they maintain their supply. So, what I'm suggesting is, it doesn't just feel like you are under attack and they are behaving in a malicious way. You are actually under attack. This is a very different type of narcissism, and it often requires a somewhat different strategy, sometimes more distance, clearer limits, or even external support. But nevertheless, the core strategies I'm outlining here today with you, recognizing the narcissistic defensive structure and seeing supply for what it is, still has value. Once you can hold that perspective, the next step is to pay attention to how those defenses are enacted, that's the word I just mentioned a moment ago, within the relationship itself. This brings us to the second strategy. Understand emotional projection into the relationship. Narcissistic individuals often project their unwanted feelings or traits onto others, leading to a dynamic where the partner starts to embody those projected aspects. From a psychodynamic perspective, navigating a relationship must include an understanding of what's being projected and then enacted between you and the other person. Now, wait a minute. You might be thinking, what does that even mean? Projection? Enactment? This is starting to sound like a psychoanalytic course you're teaching, not the podcast I signed up to listen to. Okay, let me try to break it down in plain English. Essentially, Projection is the process by which a person pushes out a part of themselves that they cannot tolerate and unconsciously pressures you to take it in. This often creates tension and confusion in the relationship. If they are dishonest, they will accuse you of being dishonest. Or here's another prototypical example. A partner might constantly accuse you of being selfish or uncaring. Over time, you may start to question yourself and feel guilty, even though these criticisms actually reflect your partner's own unacknowledged insecurity. Recognizing this allows you to see the feelings as coming from them, not as an objective truth about you, and then therefore it positions you, fingers crossed, right, if you could get some space, to respond from awareness rather than from instinct. The risk is that without this awareness, you may begin to take on these projected feelings as your own and start living them. For instance, you might, in subtle ways, slip into roles such as the endless giver of supplies, admiration, the caregiver or fixer, or even the one who's always doing something wrong, the incompetent one or the incapable one. For instance, you may feel suddenly, and I'm quoting, incompetent or not enough, because these are the things I hear from my own patients. So you begin to feel this way when these messages are actually coming from the narcissist unprocessed shame. You might also find yourself repeatedly in the caregiver role, constantly offering validation and support while neglecting your own needs. I hear this frequently. Let's say you make a minor mistake and broke something on accident. Your partner blows this up, accusing you of rushing, being clumsy, or not paying attention. Over time, you start doubting your competence, believing you are truly, and I quote, incapable, when in reality, these feelings were projections, unwanted, unmetabolized feelings belonging to your partner. Understanding projective dynamics allows you to step back and ask, is this truly mine, or is it being projected onto me? And even if there is a grain of truth, even if you were clumsy and you broke something, you can still ask yourself, why do they need to blow this up, insult, and make me feel completely inadequate? By reflecting in this way, and when appropriate, discussing or raising these questions with your partner, you take the second step toward reclaiming your own emotional experience. And this awareness plus reclaiming your own emotional experience helps you navigate a narcissistic relationship from a place of clarity and control rather than reactivity, potentially keeping you grounded even in some really challenging interactions. Once you've started to recognize projections and reclaim your own emotional experience, the third step is to take a dual perspective, looking not only at what's happening in the relationship, but what's happening within yourself. This is often the most challenging step. It's one thing to recognize defenses in someone else, but it's much harder to turn the lens inward and ask, why do I keep getting pulled into this dynamic? What in me feels compelled to take on these roles? Or what compels me to attack or insist on my point of view, even though I know I'm not being heard? Most people can't do this part alone, and that's completely understandable. Sometimes it takes support, reflection, and often guidance from therapy or spaces like this podcast to begin seeing how history shapes the way we respond today. This is the deeper work, and while it's difficult, it's also where real freedom starts to emerge. This approach allows you to notice how you might be unconsciously, yes, unintentionally that means, without knowing it, stepping into roles that they assign, and why certain dynamics feel so familiar or compelling. Those are the things you may start to notice. This third strategy is to cultivate what we're calling this dual perspective. It often starts with asking yourself, are old patterns of, and here you could fill in the blank, of pleasing, perfectionism, of feeling guilty, of feeling blamed or diminished? Is that what's being revived here in the present moment? Once you can identify these patterns internally, you can start noticing how they play out in real time, especially in the way you communicate with your partner. However, even when you gain awareness of the dynamic, it's still easy to unknowingly, remember I said it earlier, unintentionally, to step into a role and, for example, give your power away at the very moment that you're trying to stand up for yourself. This is where small shifts in language and stance can make a profound difference. Often, I help someone notice how they may be giving away their power in subtle ways, placing their sense of emotional safety entirely in their partner's hands without even realizing it. A common example is when someone says, and I quote, "I need you to stop yelling at me," or "It hurts me when you put me down," unquote. These are completely reasonable statements, but in moments like this, they unintentionally hand control to your partner. You see, even though you're saying it hurts me, you think you're sharing a feeling, and that's what you're supposed to do, right? You're supposed to share your feelings, but what I'm saying is this unintentionally hands over control. It's as if your well-being depends on whether your partner listens, stops, or changes their behavior. Or the more you engage in arguments, or you try, and I quote, to convince them, the more power and control they gain. Each time you defend yourself, you step into a reactive, one-down position, responding to their agenda rather than acting on your own. In their mind, they are empowered because they're dictating the conversation while you are being pulled into their dynamic instead of maintaining your own sense of authority and emotional balance. The goal here is not to overwhelm you with too many of these subtle ways this dynamic shows up, but here are a few more that might sound familiar to you. You might find yourself thinking, if I'm patient enough, kind enough, explain things clearly enough, they will finally hear me. Maybe they'll even change. But often, your efforts are interpreted as wins for them. The more you try to prove your point or earn their understanding, the more you're feeding the dynamic and draining yourself in the process. It's common to look to them for validation or closure, maybe an apology, acknowledgement that they got something wrong, or even just understanding you. But that sense of resolution can only come from within you. Relying on them to provide it, again, hands over your power. I can keep going, but the goal is simple, though I know it can feel very complicated to achieve. It's about noticing the subtle ways you might be giving away your power and taking steps, even small ones, to reclaim it. Oftentimes, to reclaim your power, I find it helpful when I ask someone to help them reflect on what would it be like to shift from asking him to clearly stating that you won't tolerate this. Or I may talk to them about how it's common to find yourself slipping into the role of fixer with someone who repeatedly needs rescuing, right? So in other words, they're being positioned to step into this role. And I might ask them, do you think stepping into that role protects you from experiencing something else? What would it be like to not reassure your wife every time she feels angry and attacks you about something you did wrong? What if you didn't reassure her? How would that feel for you? So, when it comes to navigating narcissistic relationships, it's not about managing the other person's behavior. It's about recognizing when, how, and why you're being pulled into relational dynamics that cause you to give away your power. So, how can someone navigate narcissistic relationships? It's about understanding the defensive structure of the narcissist, recognizing when you're being drawn into projected roles, maintaining a dual perspective, and taking conscious control of your own sense of self and emotional responses. Navigating these relationships is not easy. It means you're learning to stay connected while protecting your sense of self. It takes clarity, courage, and a lot of self-compassion, but every small step you take to hold on to yourself truly matters. Okay, look, I feel like I'm just warming up because there's still so much more to say about this. I have so many more examples of how one can get back their own power, but we have to hold off there for today. If this spoke to you and you're curious to learn more about all issues related to narcissism, please support the show by subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. And even more importantly, take a moment to leave a review. Reviews make the podcast easier for others to find, which helps the show grow. The more the show grows, the more I can invest in creating thoughtful content that supports you in understanding and navigating your experiences with narcissism. Okay, thanks for being here with me. I'm grateful we got to explore this one together. Until next time, take care of yourself. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.